So let's just start with what's happening nationally. Reaction to what you're seeing on that scale and also the protests here in our city.
Well, the pain and anger that we see all across our country is very real, and it's something that has been, in many ways, building for a long time because we continue to see these kinds of incidents where a black man is killed by a police officer that often ends up being murder. And when people see that video, I think people think it's murder, and so they're rightfully angry. Now, in our city, we have our own challenges. In some ways, they're the same because we deal with racism, we deal with anti-blackness, but we also are very different in that we're under a consent decree. We've started the process of reform. So we've got a long way to go, but I think our situation is a lot different than a lot of these other major cities around the country.
You ran on a platform of hiring 100 police officers every year for 4 years, and you've been reaching that goal on an annual basis. What does APD reform look like, or what defunding the police looks like, if there's a plan to hire more police officers, yet there's this national outcry to defund the police?
You know, this is a good example where Albuquerque really has to carve its own path because we came into a place of shortage. So unlike these other departments that have too many officers and there's plenty of sort of resources you can trim, we've been in the reverse situation, right? We've got the highest violent crime rates in the country, and we have an officer shortage that's been widely documented. So we have to adequately fund violent crime law enforcement, and that means we got to get those other officers. But here in Albuquerque, we can do things like we're trying to shift towards diversion programs, towards violence intervention programs. All of these are essentially, in many ways, decriminalizing sort of the interaction between the police and individuals. And so trying to have more civilian interactions and trying to invest in communities, trying to invest in upstream issues like education and poverty, we absolutely have to do a better job at that.
So is that still the goal, at least 100 more police officers moving forward? And how does the DOJ consent decree kind of play a role in that?
You know, again, we still need that because of where we're coming from, and our response times are so low. Everyone knows this in Albuquerque, that we've just got to be able to respond to calls, and that takes more officers. Now, also in our department, we can't really do anything without a judge and a bunch of other signers to the consent decree to sign off. So everything for us has to go right to court. It's held at an open process with transparent reports by the independent monitor. And that's what we have to go through to really drive any kind of change in our department, including changing hiring.
Has that made things more difficult for you, or has it helped in some way to have some sort of guidance from the DOJ?
I think as we look back on it, it has helped a lot with respect to use of force. You know, our department is in a different place when it comes to things like use of force. And that's an initiative that we leaned into when our administration came in. The downside, though, is it's extremely frustrating. We're not really in charge of our department. And so if I want to make quick changes, you can't do it. The judge is in charge.
Moving forward, do you plan on allocating some of the resources given to APD to shift to some of those programs you were talking about?
We do. In fact, we're going to use the budget cycle for us is coming up in August. And so we're going to really look at how we can continue to move more funds to civilian interactions. So that's through our violence intervention team and our COAST teams, how we deal with homelessness and mentally ill. We really want to increase what we're doing in that area and continue to fund things like youth programs and diversion programs. So that's going to be a real focus for our administration, but we still need those 400 officers, there's no doubt.
And in places like Norway, the police officers go through 3 years of training at some sort of national police academy. What do our officers go through, and do you think that's enough?
You know, this is another example of, because of the DOJ, we've actually made a lot of changes in our academy, and it actually still has a lot of challenges. But we now have about 1.5 years of training, and then there's also 4 months of on-the-job training. Those are the highest standards in the state, but they're not the highest in the world. And so it's something we continually look at. Actually, every year we evaluate the training standards. But right now, on a relative basis, we are doing much better than those cities.
Another issue is when it comes to de-escalation or crisis intervention. A lot of that was added on kind of later on. I'm sure the new officers might be learning it in the academy right now, but for some of the older ones, you know, it's an add-on course, a few more hours, another day. Does that change things in terms of being able to ingrain those types of really important training elements before they're out on the field?
You know, what we've learned from the DOJ process is we have to do training on the front end, and then you have to hold people accountable on the back end. And we're working on both of those, and you have to do both of those things. The training we try and make more and more effective based on best practices around the country. And so we've seen certainly for use of force. I mean, this is an example where our department is just in a completely different place than it was before on use of force. And it also is with respect, I think, to our community-driven aspect to like constitutional community policing. And that's all from training. Like use of force, all the old officers had to go back through use of force training, and we're almost done with that. That's one of the, I think, major goals we've accomplished in this administration. But there's always, more training is always a good thing. There's also a question of if we need officers, how long can we wait and how long can we fund for them to be in constant training? Because they also need to be trained on the job.
Do you think we're asking our officers to do too much, when it comes to homelessness, drug addiction, fighting some property crime that might have to do with poverty, and then there's mental health services? Are we asking them to do more than what they signed up for?
This has been a really interesting part of what I've learned, I think, even in the last few weeks, because the past administration and our administration, their answer to trying to help with these upstream challenges was to train officers in other areas like homelessness, mental health, dealing with all these things. And I think in hindsight, actually, we are asking our officers to do way too much. And going forward, we're actually going to look at, I think, a different strategy, which is about how can we have our officers just focus on violent crime police work, and instead not have them having to deal with homelessness, having to deal with mental health. And so I think that's our challenge going forward.
So is that kind of your vision of when people say defund the police in terms of allocating resources to make sure the officers can just focus on violent crimes?
I do, and that term has a lot of different definitions. That's why it's been confusing for folks. But I think for us it is. It's really about focusing the officers, right, on their job, what they're trained to do in the job that they signed up for, and then it's about reallocating all the other resources to other professionals like social workers and behavioral health professionals to deal with those kinds of challenges.
There's a lot of conversations about police unions and police misconduct. Have you gotten any pushback in terms of dealing with something like this? We haven't had like a national case so far, but in terms of making sure you can hold your officers accountable despite a strong union behind them?
This is something, again, that because of the consent decree, we have been going back and forth with our union for the last 3 years. So we disagree all the time, and we agree just about as much. And so basically we fight it out in court, and then we move forward. And I think it's actually been a productive relationship. That's the good news under my administration, is we've been able to find a path forward for reform together.
We talked about banning chokeholds, something Albuquerque has done for a long time. Do you think a ban is enough? Because when we talk about Eric Garner, it was already banned for the NYPD, but it still happened. So what other steps can you guys be taking if a ban can still lead to results like that?
Well, there's a couple of things. Number one, again, we have banned it here, and what you can do is, you have to train on things that are just not allowed, in a sense that you have to actually tell people that, like, you cannot do that. So that's one piece about being transparent. The other piece, though, is around peer accountability. And this is another area where, again, we've started this program called the EPIC program that provides a way for officers to essentially call out other officers who are doing something wrong, and it provides them the appropriate protections so there's no retribution against them. This is a very forward-looking program, and it's something that I believe would have saved dozens of lives because we saw in Minnesota, there are officers watching this happen. I have to believe that would not happen in this town.
Your team talked about plans moving forward on Monday. What can you tell us about that, and what do you want people to know?
I think we're still working up the details, but we're going to begin a discussion on this notion of the role of officers and how we can get them to focus on fighting crime, and then how we can look at restructuring and looking at reallocating resources to better deal with these challenges around whether it's homelessness or behavioral health or even youth programs. That's the direction that we want to go, and we're going to kick off sort of the budget process that will end in August, but we're going to provide some guidelines next week on what we got to do.
Do you think your officers have been guilty of racist policing?
I think for our department, we know that we have challenges around racism, and so does the city, and I think, frankly, so does most Americans. So I don't think we're in any way immune from any of that. But what we have to do is, if there is a legitimate example that violates something, we have to hold them accountable. And I think that's something where we've got a long way to go. But that said, I know our officers save lives every day, and I know there are a whole lot of officers who are not at all. And I think that's important to remember too.